Everyone avoided the black man at the wedding. They whispered, they stared, they refused him a seat. But when the bride finally said his name, the entire celebration stopped. What happened next exposed secrets that would destroy a family empire and send shockwaves through an entire community. This is the story of how one wedding became a federal crime scene. The afternoon sun cast golden rays across the manicured lawns of the Grand Palace Estate, where 300 of the city's most influential people had gathered for what society columnists were calling the wedding of the year. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light like diamonds. Designer gowns swept across perfectly trimmed grass. An 8-piece orchestra played classical arrangements that floated through the air like whispered secrets. Daniel Washington stood at the ornate iron gates, adjusting the collar of his well-pressed navy suit. Simple, classic, impeccable. At 35, he cut a striking figure, tall and confident, with intelligent eyes that seemed to observe everything while revealing nothing. He had driven 3 hours from the capital to be here, navigating winding country roads and second-guessing his decision with every mile. Now, standing before the grandeur of the Coleman family estate, he wondered if this had been a terrible mistake. "Excuse me, sir." The security guard's voice carried that particular tone of polite hostility that Daniel had learned to recognize over a lifetime. "Do you have an invitation?" Daniel watched his other guests, white couples in designer clothes, elderly women dripping with jewelry, young men in custom tuxedos, walk past the checkpoint without even breaking stride. Some received warm greetings from the security staff. Others simply nodded and continued through, their presence alone serving as their credential. But for Daniel, there would be questions. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the elegant invitation, its gold-edged cardstock embossed with the names Amanda Louise Coleman and Robert Harrison Whitmore, Jr. The security guard took it with evident skepticism, examining it as though it might be counterfeit. He turned it over, held it up to the light, even ran his finger across the embossing to feel its authenticity. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. "This seems to be an order," the guard finally admitted, his disappointment barely concealed. "But I'll need to verify with the event coordinator." "Of course," Daniel replied, his voice calm and measured. "Take your time." He had known this would happen. He had prepared for it. Every slight, every suspicious glance, every extra hurdle. He had expected them all. In fact, he was counting on them. After another excruciating 5 minutes and a radio call that involved 3 different people, Daniel was finally allowed to enter. He walked through the gates, past the whispering security guards, and onto the grounds where American privilege displayed itself in its most refined form. The estate was breathtaking. A colonial mansion with white columns rose majestically against the blue sky, its architecture speaking of old money and older traditions. Formal gardens stretched in every direction, dotted with white tents where elegant guests mingled beneath billowing fabric. Tables draped in ivory linen stood ready for reception, each centerpiece a masterpiece of pink roses and white peonies that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was the people who truly defined the space. This was a gathering of the region's elite, judges, business owners, politicians, and their families. Women wore haute couture gowns that cost more than cars. Men sported watches that could fund college educations. The air buzzed with particular energy of people who had never questioned their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Daniel made his way across the lawn toward the main tent where the ceremony would take place. His simple suit, expensive but understated, stood in stark contrast to the designer tuxedos and custom-made ensembles surrounding him. And people noticed. Conversations paused mid-sentence as he passed. Heads turned, then quickly turned away when he made eye contact. Small groups subtly shifted their positions, creating bubbles of space that isolated him like a force field. It was a choreography of exclusion, so practiced, it seemed almost unconscious. "Who is that man?" A gray-haired woman in pearls whispered loudly to her companion, making no effort to lower her voice. "I don't recognize him from the Coleman or Whitmore families." "Neither do I," her friend replied, equally loud. "How odd." Daniel continued walking, his expression serene, his posture relaxed. Inside, he was cataloging everything, every whisper, every stare, every moment of deliberate exclusion. His mind worked like a camera, capturing evidence that would prove invaluable in the days to come. He approached the table near the middle of the tent, drawn by the elegant place settings and the fact that several seats remained empty. There were no name cards, no reserve signs. Just as he pulled out a chair, a middle-aged woman in a lavender dress materialized at his elbow. "I'm so sorry," she said, her smile as fake as her eyelashes, "but these seats are reserved for the groom's family." Daniel looked at the table. No names, no markers, nothing to indicate any reservation whatsoever. "I see," he replied calmly. "My apologies." He moved to another table, this one near the side of the tent. Again, as soon as he approached, a man in his 60s, face red from champagne or outrage, stepped forward. "These are for the bride's college friends," the man announced, positioning himself physically between Daniel and the empty chairs. "Of course. Thank you." Third table. Fourth table. Each time, a different excuse delivered with varying degrees of barely concealed hostility. The seats were taken. They were reserved. They were being saved. The explanations multiplied, but the message remained singular and clear. You are not welcome here. Finally, Daniel found an isolated chair near the catering entrance where his staff rushed in and out with trays. No one objected to him sitting there. Out of sight, away from the celebration proper, positioned where servants and invisible people belonged. He sat down, pulled out his phone, and sent a brief text message. I'm here. It's already starting. The reply came within seconds. Document everything. The wedding coordinator's voice crackled over the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The ceremony will begin in 5 minutes. As guests rushed to find their places, Daniel watched the waiter pass by carrying a tray of champagne. The young man, probably college-aged, served drinks to everyone in the immediate vicinity. Except Daniel. He walked right past him as though he were furniture. Excuse me, Daniel called out politely. The waiter turned, surprised, as if he hadn't noticed Daniel sitting there. Oh, yes. May I have a glass? I need to check if we have enough. The lie was clumsy and obvious. I'll be right back. 20 minutes later, the waiter had not returned. The ceremony began with all the pageantry money. Goodbye. The groom, Robert Whitmore Jr., stood at the altar in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his posture perfect, his smile confident. He was handsome in that generic way that comes from good genetics, expensive dental work, and a lifetime of proper nutrition. At 28, he already carried himself like the heir to his family's insurance fortune, which is exactly what he was. The bridesmaids processed down the aisle in matching blush pink gowns, followed by the flower girl, and finally, the bride. Amanda Coleman was stunning. Her French lace gown must have cost $40,000, fitted perfectly to her slender frame. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate updo adorned with tiny pearls. She held a cascading bouquet of white roses and walked with the measured grace of someone who had practiced this moment 1,000 times. Daniel watched her approach, his expression carefully neutral. And then their eyes met. Amanda's step faltered, her face, glowing with bridal radiance just a moment before, suddenly paled to the color of her dress. Her eyes widened in recognition, then horror, then something more complex, a mixture of fear, guilt, and desperate calculation. She recovered quickly, professional as she was, but Daniel had seen everything he needed to see in those 2 seconds. She knew exactly who he was, and she knew exactly why he was here. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Guests applauded as the new couple kissed and walked back down the aisle together, smiling for the photographer who captured every angle of their perfect moment. Through it all, Amanda never looked in Daniel's direction again. The reception began with the requisite champagne toasts and the cutting of an elaborate 5-tier cake. Daniel remained in his isolated corner, watching the celebration unfold like an anthropologist observing tribal rituals. The DJ announced the father-daughter dance, and Colonel Coleman, a stern-faced man in his 70s with military bearing, took his daughter's hand while guests watched sentimentally. Daniel had researched Colonel Marcus Coleman extensively, decorated veteran, real estate magnate, philanthropist. His company, Coleman Enterprises, had built half the residential developments in the county over the past 30 years. On paper, he was a pillar of the community. But Daniel knew what wasn't on paper. As the party continued, Daniel attempted to approach the bar for water. 3 men in expensive suits immediately positioned themselves in front of him, their conversation strategically blocking his path. Sorry, buddy, one of them said without looking at Daniel. We're kind of in the middle of something here. They laughed at some shared joke, their backs forming a wall. Daniel stepped back and tried another route. The same thing happened, different people, same result. It was like watching an immune system respond to a perceived threat, with white blood cells swarming to isolate and expel the foreign presence. He gave up on the bar and headed toward the restroom. The line mysteriously reorganized itself whenever he approached. Men who arrived after him were somehow waved ahead. Conversations erupted in front of him, creating human barriers that seemed coincidental but were anything but. After waiting 15 minutes without moving an inch forward, Daniel walked away and headed to the garden terrace for some air. The outdoor space offered a moment of peace. He stood by the balustrade, looking out over the manicured gardens, and pulled out his phone. 3 hours in, every expectation exceeded. They're building our case for us. The reply, perfect. Keep your cool. Let them show their true colors. He was putting his phone away when a sharp voice cut through the evening air. Excuse me, young man. Daniel turned to find Mrs. Gloria Coleman, the bride's mother, marching toward him with the determined stride of someone accustomed to command. She wore a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than a used car, and her expression carried that particular blend of suspicion and superiority that certain wealthy women cultivate like an art form. This is a private event. she announced, her eyes scanning Daniel from head to toe, searching for flaws in his appearance and finding none. "I don't believe I've seen you before." "I'm just getting some fresh air, ma'am," Daniel replied politely. "Fresh air?" She laughed, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. "Listen carefully. I don't know how you obtained an invitation to my daughter's wedding, but I strongly suggest you leave before my husband calls the authorities. We know everyone of significance in this community, and you," she paused meaningfully, "are definitely not one of them." The final words dripped with venom that required no translation. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Coleman." "My concern?" Her voice rose an octave. "This is the most important day of my daughter's life, and I will not allow it to be ruined by people like you showing up uninvited and unwelcome." Other guests had begun gathering on the terrace, drawn by the raised voices. Margaret Whitfield, a local socialite known for her traditional values, approached with a practiced smile. "Everything all right here, Gloria?" she asked, though her eyes had already categorized Daniel as the problem. "Just handling a small situation regarding proper invitations and social boundaries," Mrs. Coleman replied. Daniel remained silent, watching the group form around him. 8 people now, all dressed in their finest, all wearing the same expression of righteous concern. This was a formation he recognized. The closing of ranks, the unified front against the outsider who had violated their sacred space. "You know," Margaret said, addressing Daniel with maternal condescension, "sometimes people get excited when they receive invitations to sophisticated events, but it's important to understand appropriate behavior and knowing one's place. You do understand what I'm saying, don't you?" Before Daniel could respond, the groom himself appeared on the terrace. "Mom, what's going on out here?" Robert Jr. asked, his forehead creased with concern. "Nothing important, dear," Mrs. Coleman assured him, "just explaining proper etiquette to this young man." Robert looked at Daniel with puzzled recognition. "Have we met before? Your face looks familiar." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Daniel met Robert's gaze steadily, his expression revealing nothing. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure," Daniel replied carefully. "Are you sure? I could swear I've seen you somewhere." Mrs. Coleman quickly intervened. "Robert, darling, you need to get back to your guests. We'll handle this minor situation." But Daniel had already seen what he needed. The flicker of recognition in Robert's eyes, the nervous way Mrs. Coleman rushed to change the subject, the sudden tension that gripped everyone on the terrace. "Of course," Daniel said softly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I don't want to cause any further misunderstanding." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Coleman whispered urgently to Margaret, "I need to talk to Amanda immediately. If she knows this person, we need to understand why he's here." Daniel heard every word. At 35, having navigated America's complex racial dynamics his entire life, he had learned that people reveal their true selves when they think no one is watching or listening. And today, every revelation was being carefully, methodically documented. He walked back into the main reception area, where Amanda stood near the elaborate cake table, talking intensely with 2 bridesmaids. Her body language screamed stress, shoulders tense, hands gesturing frantically, eyes darting around the room. When one of her friends discreetly pointed in Daniel's direction, Amanda shook her head vigorously, clearly denying something. It was fascinating to watch. Here was a woman on what should be the happiest day of her life, surrounded by celebration and luxury, yet radiating pure panic, because she knew exactly who Daniel Washington was. She knew why he had traveled 3 hours to be here, and she knew that every moment he remained was another moment closer to her carefully constructed world crumbling into dust. The wedding photographer approached Daniel, camera in hand. "Excuse me, sir. Would you mind stepping aside for a moment? I'm trying to capture the celebration without visual distractions." "Visual distractions," Daniel repeated calmly. "Well, you know, people who don't quite fit the aesthetic we're going for. This is a high-end wedding album. We need consistency." Daniel smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a friendly smile. Of course, wouldn't want to interfere with the aesthetic. Every insult, every exclusion, every moment of casual cruelty. Daniel cataloged them all with the precision of someone who understood their ultimate value. These people thought they were protecting their social event from an unwelcome intruder. They had no idea they were documenting their own destruction. As the golden hour light began to fade and the party moved toward dinner, Daniel returned to his isolated seat near the catering entrance. He pulled out his phone and sent one more message. Phase 1 complete. Subject and family fully documented. They've exceeded even our worst expectations. Ready for Phase 2. The reply came instantly. FBI team is 30 minutes out. Hold position. Let them keep digging their hole deeper. Daniel leaned back in his chair and watched Amanda hide behind a column whenever their eyes met across the room. She wasn't just avoiding an inconvenient guest. She was avoiding the reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. And that reckoning was about to arrive.
"Daniel! You're under arrest!"
The dinner service began as the sun set behind the Coleman estate, casting long shadows across tables adorned with flickering candles and crystal. Waiters moved efficiently through the crowd, serving plates of herb-crusted lamb and roasted vegetables to the 300 guests who represented the pinnacle of regional society. Daniel watched from his corner as plates were delivered to every table, except his. 3 different servers walked past him carrying trays, their eyes seeming to slide right over him as though he occupied some invisible dimension. It was a masterclass in casual dehumanization, executed with a smooth efficiency of people who had perfected the art of exclusion. Finally, a young waiter, barely 20, nervous and fidgeting, approached with a single plate. "I'm sorry about the delay, sir," the boy whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "They told us to skip your area, but that's not right. That's just not right." Daniel looked up at the young man, noting the moral courage it took to break ranks with his supervisors. "What's your name?" "Thomas, sir." "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate your integrity." The boy nodded quickly and hurried away before anyone could notice his small act of rebellion. Daniel filed the interaction away, one decent person in a sea of complicity. Thomas will remember this night, and hopefully learn from it. As Daniel ate his meal alone, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. "Status update. FBI team in position. Federal warrants finalized. We have authorization for immediate action. Waiting for your signal. David." Daniel typed back, "Give me 15 more minutes. Let the bride and her family dig the hole a little deeper." David Peterson was more than Daniel's law partner. He was his closest friend and the co-architect of an investigation that had consumed their lives for the past 8 months. Together, they had built a case so airtight, so meticulously documented, that it would redefine how the federal government prosecuted housing discrimination cases. And it all centered on the woman currently cutting her wedding cake to enthusiastic applause. Amanda Coleman, now Amanda Whitmore, smiled for the cameras as she and her new husband fed each other bites of vanilla cake with raspberry filling. The guests cheered. The photographer captured every angle. It was a picture-perfect moment of American wedding tradition. What none of these people knew was that the bride had spent the past 3 years as a subject of federal investigation into conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations that had destroyed the lives of dozens of families. Daniel watched her laugh at something Robert whispered in her ear, and he felt no satisfaction in what was about to happen. Only the cold certainty that justice, delayed for too long, was finally about to be served. The DJ announced that the dance floor was open, and couples began swaying to the orchestral arrangements. Daniel remained seated, observing the social dynamics with the trained eye of someone who understood that behavior patterns reveal truth more reliably than words. Mrs. Coleman returned to the terrace, this time accompanied by reinforcements. Colonel Coleman himself, the family patriarch and the architect of the empire about to crumble, walked with military precision toward Daniel's position. At 72, Marcus Coleman remained an imposing figure. His posture was parade ground straight, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his gaze sharp with the authority of someone accustomed to command. He had built Coleman Enterprises from a small construction company into a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions. In this community, his word was law. "Young man," the colonel's voice carried the weight of decades of military command, "my wife has informed me of your inappropriate presence at our family celebration." Daniel stood respectfully. "Colonel Coleman, it's an honor to meet you, sir." The old military man's eyes narrowed. There was something about Daniel's bearing, the way he held eye contact, the absence of intimidation in his voice, that clearly disturbed the colonel. "Honor," he repeated with disdain. "Honor is earned through service, sacrifice, and genuine contribution to society. It is not earned by intruding where you don't belong." "I understand your perspective perfectly, sir." The calm, articulate response seemed to catch the colonel off guard. He had expected stammering, intimidation, perhaps humble apologies. Instead, he faced someone with composure that suggested insider knowledge. "Where do you know our Amanda from?" Mrs. Coleman demanded, joining the interrogation. Daniel paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Our history is complex, Mrs. Coleman. Some chapters are best reserved for more appropriate moments." Across the reception area, Amanda watched the conversation with mounting horror. She whispered something urgent to her maid of honor, who shook her head worriedly. Margaret Whitfield approached again, this time with 2 equally well-dressed friends in tow. "Colonel, this person is disturbing all the guests. Perhaps it's time for more direct measures." "What kind of measures?" Daniel asked calmly, his hand moving subtly to activate his phone's recording function. "The kind that people like you understand," Margaret replied with a cruel smile. "A call to the sheriff. Perhaps a thorough background check. Maybe an investigation into how you obtained this invitation through deceptive means." "Investigations can be quite revealing," Daniel agreed neutrally. "Sometimes they uncover fascinating information about all parties involved." Something in his tone, too calm, too knowing, began to unsettle the group. This wasn't playing out according to their expectations. The man they were trying to intimidate showed no fear, no embarrassment, no sign of backing down. "I'm calling Sheriff Martinez personally," the colonel announced, pulling out his phone. "He owes me several favors and can manufacture a legal reason to remove you from this property." "Sheriff Martinez," Daniel repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting choice." Again, that knowing tone. The colonel hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. How could this man, this uninvited intruder, speak about the sheriff like someone who knew him personally, like someone who knew things about the relationship between the colonel and Martinez that might prove problematic? At that moment, Amanda finally broke. She marched across the reception area, her wedding dress billowing dramatically, guests parting like the Red Sea as she approached. "Mom, Dad, stop this immediately," she said, trying to sound authoritative but failing to hide the tremor in her voice. "Amanda, dear, I know exactly what you're doing," Amanda interrupted. "And it's humiliating." She turned to Daniel, her face a mask of forced politeness. "Daniel, thank you for coming. It was unexpected, but I appreciate the gesture." The public acknowledgement stunned the family into silence. The colonel looked between his daughter and Daniel with growing suspicion. "You two know each other?" Margaret asked, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing. "Yes," Amanda said quickly. We were acquaintances years ago. From law school. It's been so long. Law school." The lie was immediate and obvious to anyone paying attention. Daniel had never attended the same law school as Amanda. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. But the falsehood revealed her desperation to control a situation rapidly spinning beyond her grasp. "How interesting," Daniel murmured. "Your memory of our shared academic experiences is quite creative." The colonel caught the implication immediately. "Amanda, if you studied together, why has there been such confusion about his presence here?" "There's no confusion, Dad. Just miscommunication." Daniel checked his watch discreetly. 3 hours and 47 minutes of high-definition recording. Every slight, every exclusion, every discriminatory act documented in detail. Amanda was now adding perjury to her growing list of problems. His phone vibrated. Status? Subject panicking. Creating contradictory stories publicly. Family fully involved. Evidence exponentially multiplying. Perfect. FBI ready to move on your signal. Make it count. Daniel pocketed his phone and smiled politely at the Coleman family. "Amanda, since you mentioned our law school days, perhaps it would be appropriate to share some memories from that time with your parents. I'm sure they'd find our history quite enlightening." The terror in Amanda's eyes was instantaneous and unmistakable. "Daniel, maybe this isn't the right time." "On the contrary," he continued smoothly, "weddings are perfect occasions to celebrate the journeys that brought us here. All the decisions, all the choices, all the consequences." Mrs. Coleman noticed her daughter's panic. "Amanda, darling, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long day." "Of course," Daniel agreed gently. "Important days can be exhausting. Sometimes the way to pass decisions makes even joyful moments feel complicated." The colonel had finally lost his patience. "Enough of these cryptic games. Sheriff Martinez will be here in 20 minutes, and you will explain yourself to him." "Actually," Daniel said, checking his phone again, "I don't think Sheriff Martinez will be available tonight. He's somewhat occupied with urgent matters. Federal matters, to be specific." The silence that followed was absolute. How did this man know about federal investigations? How could he predict the sheriff's schedule? The questions hung unspoken in the air as the group exchanged worried glances. It was then that Amanda fully understood the magnitude of her miscalculation. Daniel wasn't just an inconvenient guest trying to embarrass her. He had come with purpose, armed with information she thought was buried forever. Every moment he remained was another piece of evidence being added to a case she couldn't see but could sense closing around her like a trap. "Amanda," Daniel said softly, "would you like to tell your family who I really am? Or shall I?" She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her new husband, Robert, stepped forward protectively. "Listen, I don't know what this is about, but you need to leave my wife alone." "Your wife?" Daniel repeated. "I wonder if you know who you married, Robert. I wonder if she's told you about her previous career. Her real work before she became the respectable corporate lawyer you think you know." "What are you talking about?" Robert demanded. Daniel's phone buzzed again. "FBI at the gates. Give the signal." He took a deep breath. 3 years of investigation, 8 months of active pursuit, for hours of systematic documentation. The moment had arrived. "My name is Daniel Washington," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the terrace where guests had fallen silent to listen. "But I haven't been completely honest about my position." He pulled a leather wallet from his inside jacket pocket and opened it to reveal official credentials with a federal seal. I'm the Advocate General for the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The words hit like a bomb. Advocate General, the third highest position in the entire federal Department of Justice, responsible for overseeing prosecutions of civil rights violations across the nation. Mrs. Coleman staggered backward. That's impossible. You're too young. You're black. Daniel completed calmly. Yes, Mrs. Coleman, I am, and I've been responsible for investigating federal civil rights violations in this state for the past 3 years. Amanda's legs gave out. She collapsed onto a nearby chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like melted ice cream. Daniel, please, she whispered. Please what, Amanda? Please don't reveal how you falsified evidence in the Harrison versus State Housing Department case. Please don't mention how you accepted bribes from Whitfield Construction to bury discrimination complaints. Or please don't discuss how you personally destroyed the lives of 17 families by denying them housing through systematic, illegal discrimination. Robert stared at his wife in horror. Amanda, what is he talking about? Robert, I can explain. Can you explain? Daniel continued relentlessly, pulling a folder from his briefcase. How you worked as inside counsel for Coleman Enterprises during your supposed law school years? Can you explain how you drafted the contracts that kept minority families out of your family's developments? Can you explain the $200,000 in payments you received to ensure certain communities never access decent housing? The colonel attempted to regain control. These are baseless accusations. Colonel Coleman, Daniel's voice took on the authority of federal law. You're under investigation for violations of the Fair Housing Act, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional rights, and money laundering through Coleman Enterprises. He gestured toward the entrance, where figures in dark suits had begun appearing. FBI agents in tactical vests, badges clearly visible, moved with practiced efficiency to secure all exits. What is this? Mrs. Coleman stammered. Sheriff Martinez himself appeared, but not as the colonel's ally. His face was pale, his movements nervous. Advocate General Washington. Martinez said, his voice shaking slightly. The federal operation is proceeding as ordered. The silence was deafening as every guest processed what they were witnessing. Daniel addressed the crowd formally. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting the celebration, but federal law enforcement has an obligation to execute lawful warrants regardless of timing. He turned back to Amanda. Amanda Louise Coleman, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No. Amanda screamed. Daniel, we had a deal. You said if I cooperated. Cooperated? Daniel's eyebrow rose. Ms. Coleman, you had 3 years to cooperate voluntarily. Instead, you chose to marry into a family under investigation, change your surname, and attempt to obstruct justice. Robert physically recoiled from his wife. Jesus Christ, Amanda, how many families did you hurt? Daniel read from his documentation. Preliminary investigations indicate that practices orchestrated by Ms. Coleman and implemented through Coleman Enterprises resulted in housing denial to approximately 2,000 families over 3 years, primarily African American and Latino families. Mrs. Coleman sank into a chair. This will destroy us. Our reputation. Our business. Everything. You should have considered that, Daniel replied without sympathy, before implementing systematic discrimination as standard business practice. The colonel made one last desperate attempt. You have no authority to conduct operations on private property without proper warrants. Daniel handed him a document folder. Federal search and seizure warrant signed by Judge Sarah Thompson this afternoon authorizes complete search of this property, including all financial documents, correspondence, and electronic devices related to Coleman Enterprises' business practices. An FBI agent approached. Sir, we've located the backup servers in the home office. All emails from the past 5 years are being copied per your instructions. Excellent. And the financial documents. 3 safes located. Federal forensic accountants are cataloging all contents. Amanda looked around desperately at all the guests. People she tried to impress, social connections she'd hoped to cultivate, the future she'd envisioned. They all stared at her like she was a stranger, like she was a criminal, because she was. Robert pulled off his wedding ring and set it on the table. I can't be married to someone who... He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. As FBI agents began cordoning off areas and directing guests to remain for questioning, Daniel felt his phone vibrate. Operation successful. Multiple suspects in custody. Evidence secured. This will be the federal case of the decade. Daniel looked at Amanda, who was now being led away in handcuffs, still wearing her $40,000 wedding dress. The irony was not lost on anyone. The woman who had tried to keep minorities out of decent homes was now being processed into the federal detention system. Sheriff Martinez approached Daniel nervously. Sir, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of the extent. Save it for your deposition. Martinez. The FBI has been investigating your relationship with the Colemans for 6 months. As the evening descended into controlled chaos, agents securing evidence, guests being interviewed, the wedding of the year transforming into a federal crime scene, Daniel stood on the terrace and looked out over the estate. Justice didn't announce itself with trumpets. It worked quietly, building cases brick by brick, until the moment arrived to bring the entire corrupt structure down. And that moment was now. The Grand Palace Estate, which hours earlier had hosted the region's most glamorous wedding, now looked like a set of federal crime drama. FBI agents in dark suits moved methodically through the grounds, cataloging evidence, interviewing witnesses, and securing documents. The elegant white tents that had sheltered champagne toasts now housed makeshift interrogation stations. The celebration of love and luxury had transformed into an operation of law and justice. Daniel Washington stood near the main house, coordinating with FBI field supervisors as they executed the multiple warrants his office had obtained. His simple navy suit, the one that made him look underdressed among the tuxedos and designer gowns, now revealed itself as a deliberate choice of a federal prosecutor who understood that justice required neither costume nor ceremony. Agent Sarah Chun, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, approached with a tablet displaying preliminary findings. Sir, the digital forensics team has already uncovered over 15,000 emails between Coleman Enterprises, Amanda Coleman, and various city officials. The correspondence clearly outlines a discrimination scheme. Contractual language? Daniel asked. Explicitly discriminatory in many cases. They didn't even bother with euphemisms in internal communications. References to keeping out undesirable elements, maintaining neighborhood character, and direct quote, ensuring our properties remain attractive to the right kind of buyers. Daniel nodded grimly. That's exactly what we need for the federal case. What about the financial records? 3 separate sets of books. One for tax authorities, one for investors, and one that shows the actual cash flows, including payoffs to building inspectors, city council members, and the sheriff's office. Martinez received approximately $170,000 over 3 years in consulting fees that conveniently coincide with his decisions to not investigate housing discrimination complaints. Through the French doors, Daniel could see Sheriff Martinez sitting with federal agents, his earlier bluster completely deflated. The man who had arrived expecting to remove Daniel as a favorite of the Colemans was now facing federal corruption charges that would end his career and possibly his freedom. Advocate General Washington? A young FBI agent approached nervously. We've secured the main servers, and forensic accountants have found evidence of systematic redlining practices going back 7 years. They literally marked maps with red lines showing areas where they would not sell properties to African American or Latino buyers. 7 years. Daniel felt the weight of that timeline. 7 years of families denied homes, children denied better schools, communities denied economic opportunities, all because of the systematic racism that Coleman Enterprises had industrialized into standard business practice. And Amanda Coleman had been the architect of much of it. She sat now in the back of an FBI van, still wearing her wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face. Through the window, Daniel could see her talking urgently to the federal public defender who had been called to the scene. Whatever defense she was trying to construct would prove futile. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel, he turned to see David Peterson jogging across the lawn, his face flushed with excitement. At 42, David was a veteran civil rights attorney who had dedicated his entire career to fighting housing discrimination. This case represented the culmination of decades of work. This is bigger than we thought, David said breathlessly. The financial records show that the discrimination scheme involved at least 9 other companies in the region. It was a coordinated effort to maintain racial segregation in housing markets across 4 counties. Do we have evidence of coordination? Email chains with 30 participants. Meeting minutes discussing strategy to preserve community standards. Bank records showing money flowing between the companies to fund a shared legal defense fund specifically for fighting discrimination lawsuits. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, processing the magnitude. This wasn't just one corrupt family. This was systemic racism operating as a business model, with multiple corporations working together to deprive thousands of families of their constitutional rights. We'll need to expand the investigation, he said. This goes to RICO territory. David nodded. Racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations charges. We can go after the entire network. The guests from the wedding have been organized into groups based on their potential relevance to the investigation. Some, mostly younger people, friends of the bride and groom with no knowledge of the business practices, were interviewed briefly and released. Others, particularly those involved with Coleman Enterprises or the related companies, found themselves facing much longer conversations with federal agents. Margaret Whitfield sat ramrod straight in a folding chair, her earlier superiority replaced by visible anxiety. Her company, Whitfield Construction, had built many of the developments that Coleman Enterprises sold. The FBI was very interested in her knowledge of the discriminatory practices. I had no idea she kept repeating to the agent interviewing her. I simply built what they asked me to build. But her emails told a different story. Messages about maintaining standards and preserving neighborhood aesthetics revealed someone who not only knew about the discrimination, but had actively participated in designing buildings and communities meant to exclude minorities. Colonel Marcus Coleman sat in his study, now an evidence collection site, watching federal agents catalog his files. At 72, he had believed himself untouchable. His military service, his business success, his connections to judges and politicians. He had constructed a fortress of privilege that he assumed would protect him forever. Now that fortress was collapsing in real time. "You won't get away with this," he told Daniel when the Advocate General entered to oversee the document collection. "I have friends at the highest levels of government." Had, Daniel corrected gently. Past tense. Most of your political connections have already distanced themselves from you. The governor's office issued a statement an hour ago condemning housing discrimination and promising full cooperation with our investigation. The old military man's face crumbled. "This will destroy my legacy. Everything I built." "No, sir," Daniel replied. "You destroyed your legacy yourself. You built it on a foundation of systematic racism and civil rights violations. We're simply documenting what you created." As midnight approached, the FBI had secured enough evidence to file federal charges against 17 individuals and 6 corporations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Years of coordinated discrimination affecting thousands of families, millions of dollars in illicit profits, and a web of corruption that extended into law enforcement, city government, and the judicial system. Daniel stood in the now-empty reception tent, surrounded by overturned chairs and abandoned champagne glasses. The wedding cake remained partially cut, a monument to celebration interrupted. Pink rose petals littered the ground like snow. His phone rang. It was the Associate Attorney General calling from Washington. "Daniel, I've been briefed on operation. Extraordinary work." "Thank you, sir. Though I have to give credit to the entire team. This investigation required hundreds of hours from dozens of agents and attorneys. The evidence package you compiled will become a model for civil rights prosecutions. We're already planning to use this case as a template for addressing systemic housing discrimination nationwide." After the call ended, Daniel walked out the gardens where he had stood hours earlier, enduring Mrs. Coleman's insults and the family's threats. The night air was cool now, and the estate was finally quiet except for the distant sound of FBI teams loading evidence into vehicles. "Quite a day," David said, joining him on the terrace. "Quite a day," Daniel agreed. "Do you remember when we first started looking into Coleman Enterprises? That family who came to us 3 years ago, the Johnsons. They had saved for 10 years to buy a house, had perfect credit, stable jobs. But they were denied by Coleman Enterprises despite being more qualified than white applicants who were approved." Daniel nodded. "That's when we knew something was systematically wrong. And when Amanda Coleman tried to falsify the records to cover it up, that's when we knew it went all the way to the top." They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the journey from that first denied application to tonight's federal operation. "You know what I keep thinking about?" David asked. "All those families who gave up, who were told no, so many times they stopped applying, who believed the lie that they weren't good enough, weren't qualified enough, weren't the right fit for certain neighborhoods. That's why this case matters," Daniel said quietly. "It's not just about punishing discrimination. It's about proving that the system can work, that when people are denied their rights, there are consequences." 6 months later, Daniel sat in his Washington, D.C. office, reviewing the latest developments in United States versus Coleman Enterprises et al. The case had become one of the most significant civil rights prosecutions in decades, drawing national attention and sparking conversations about housing discrimination across the country. The verdicts had been decisive. Amanda Coleman, convicted on 17 counts, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, fraud, and obstruction of justice, sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Colonel Marcus Coleman, convicted on 23 counts. Given his age and health, he received 5 years of house arrest and ordered to pay $4.7 million in fines and restitution. Sheriff Martinez, convicted of corruption and conspiracy, sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Margaret Whitfield, convicted as a co-conspirator, lost her construction company, which was liquidated to pay fines and restitution to victims. Coleman Enterprises, forced into bankruptcy. All assets were liquidated, with proceeds going to a victim compensation fund that would help the families that had been denied housing. But the numbers only told part of the story. Daniel opened a folder containing letters from victims. Families who had been denied homes, who had been told they didn't belong, who had suffered years of discrimination before justice finally arrived. One letter was from Marcus Johnson, the man whose denied application had started the entire investigation. "Dear Advocate General Washington, I want to thank you for believing us when everyone else said we were imagining things. When Coleman Enterprises denied our application, they made us feel like we were the problem, like we weren't good enough. We started doubting ourselves. But you proved that the problem wasn't us. It was them. We finally bought a house last month. It's in one of the neighborhoods that Coleman Enterprises used to control. My children have a yard. My wife has her dream kitchen. We have space for my mother to visit. More than that, we have our dignity back. Thank you for fighting for families like ours. Daniel set down the letter and looked at the framed photograph on his desk. 17 families standing in front of their new homes, built with funds recovered from the Coleman prosecution. Children played on front lawns. Parents smiled from porches. It was a victory that mattered. The wedding had ended in handcuffs and federal charges. But from that wreckage had come justice, reform, and hope for thousands of families. The case had prompted broader reforms. New legislation strengthened enforcement of fair housing laws. The Justice Department established new protocols for investigating systemic discrimination. Law schools added the Coleman case to their civil rights curricula, using it to teach future lawyers about the importance of thorough investigation and fearless prosecution. Daniel received speaking invitations from across the country, but he remained focused on the work. There were other cases, other families being denied their rights, other systems of discrimination that needed to be dismantled. On the anniversary of the wedding operation, Daniel returned to the area to meet with some of the families who had benefited from the Victim Compensation Fund. They gathered in a community center, one that had been built on land formerly owned by Coleman Enterprises. A young mother approached him, holding her toddler. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to introduce you to Marcus Jr. We named him after Marcus Johnson, the man whose case started everything. We wanted to remember that justice is possible." As Daniel held the child, he thought about that day at the wedding, the insults, the exclusion, the systematic dehumanization he had endured. Every slight had been worth it. Every whispered insult, every denied seat, every moment of casual cruelty had served a purpose: to document, to expose, to prove. Thomas, the young waiter who had brought Daniel food when everyone else ignored him, was also there. He now worked as a paralegal for a civil rights organization, inspired by what he had witnessed. "You taught me something that night," Thomas told Daniel. "You showed me that dignity isn't about how people treat you. It's about how you respond to injustice." In her federal prison cell, Amanda Coleman had time to reflect on the choices that had led her there. The lavish wedding that was supposed to be the beginning of her perfect life had instead become the moment when all her crimes were exposed. She wrote Daniel a letter, one of dozens she had sent over months, all returned unopened. "Daniel, I know you won't read this, but I need to write it anyway. I was 23 when I started working for my father's company. He taught me that business required tough decisions, that protecting property values was just smart economics, that keeping certain people out was about maintaining standards, not discrimination. I believed him. Or maybe I just didn't want to see the truth. Every application I denied, I told myself it was business. But it wasn't. It was racism. Systematic, intentional, devastating racism. I stole futures from families. I denied children better schools. I robbed people of opportunities because of their skin color. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate. I know it doesn't undo the harm. But I am genuinely, deeply sorry. I hope the families I hurt find peace. I hope the compensation fund helps rebuild what I helped destroy. And I hope that somewhere, someday, I can find a way to make even the smallest amends." The letter would go unread, like all the others. Daniel had no interest in Amanda Coleman's personal redemption. His focus remained on systematic change, on ensuring that the structures that had enabled her crimes could never operate again. Epilogue. 5 years after the wedding, Daniel Washington stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, nominated for a position on the Federal Appeals Court. During his confirmation hearing, senators from both parties praised his work on the Coleman case. "You could have arrested Amanda Coleman quietly," one senator noted. "Why wait until her wedding?" Some have criticized that as theatrical. Daniel considered his response carefully. "Senator, we didn't wait until her wedding. We waited until we had incontrovertible evidence. The wedding date was her choice, not ours. And frankly, the operation served an important purpose. It documented in real time the very attitudes and behaviors that enabled discrimination to flourish. The systematic exclusion I experienced that day, the denied seats, the refused service, the whispered insults, that's what thousands of families face when trying to access housing in America. The only difference is that I was there with federal authority to do something about it.